G'day, mate. Luke Ford here with my friend Richard. We're going to talk about work on the digital frontier. Richard, over to you, sir.
All right. Yeah, this is a subject that's really near and dear to my heart. I wanted to talk about uh, a, a law that was recently passed in the state of California called Assembly Bill 5 or AB 5. Talk about it's
Yes.
legislation that's really targeted toward the gig economy to try to convert um, independent contractors into employees. But before I do that, I want to really create a context for the discussion because I think it's really important to understand, you know, why there are problems with this. And I think it really goes beyond, some of the arguments that people who are against this bill say, well, it's going to take away, flexibility from people who want to, work when they want to work and they don't want to have to be employees. And that's true. A lot of people would prefer to have an on-demand job, where you log into an app when you feel like it and log out when you're done. You don't have a boss to report to. You don't, have anything like that. Um, so, but I think to put that into its context, I think it's really important to understand what I mean when I say the digital frontier. Just out of curiosity, when I say that, what comes to mind for you?
Anything related to the internet?
Okay, that's fair. I'd like to expand that view a little bit. I'm gonna go back in history a little bit. In 1830, America had approximately 12 million citizens living in the United States. Now, there probably some people would say, well, what about slaves and what about that? And there were probably a few more that weren't counted in that particular census. But the population was right around that. It was somewhere between 12 and 16 million. Most of those people were involved in agriculture, and a large majority of them, more than 70%, were subsistence farmers. That means that they got up in the morning, before the sun came up, went out, milked their cows, plowed their fields, picked their crops, came home, canned stuff and cooked stuff and dried stuff and did all those things so they could put food on the table and maybe with a little luck have a little extra left over to get some extra cash. Most people did that. That was in 1830. So 3/4 of the population in one capacity or another was involved in agriculture. Okay. Now, when that changed, when industrialization started to happen, started to build factories, started to have someone be able to work in a factory, you have to take them off the farm. Well, that's a very different work paradigm. It's a completely different work paradigm. Most farms were family farms. So basically you had the family, sometimes the extended family, and they were all working together. And they stayed on a piece of land, and that's pretty much what they did. There were some exceptions, but again, probably 3 out of 4 people in the United States, that's what they did. Then they started going to factories, and so they left those. They started to come off those farms, so they had to learn new skills. They had to, in some cases, move into the city. In some cases, they had to sell their farms, in which cases some larger farm concerns may have bought those up. But that process of industrialization, you could call, at that time, the industrial frontier. In 1830, you had the industrial frontier. So you had this complete sociological shift from an agricultural society to an industrial society that probably began in 1810, somewhere in there, but really continued and really kind of hit its peak, or at least one of its peaks, in the 1880s, when you had Rockefeller and Carnegie's and all of those those fellows who had really created the businesses and the context for most people to be able to work in a factory. Now, you still had farmers, but most people were working in a factory, and that was there were some economic depressions in there. In the 1870s, there was a tremendous economic depression when a lot of speculation on railroads crashed, and the economy was probably, by some people's reckoning, worse than the Great Depression. There just weren't as many people involved. The people were out of work. They couldn't find things to do. There was nothing for them to do. So that really informs the concern that people have today when we start looking at things like, oh my gosh, we've got artificial intelligence coming in. If you're a paralegal, artificial intelligence should scare you because your job is going away. A paralegal might spend, half their time in a given week looking at case law, and it might take them, 15, 20 hours doing that research. Artificial intelligence can do that in a matter of minutes. It can find a much more comprehensive list of that case law in a fraction of the time. There's no question that job is going to be automated away. If you go to a McDonald's, you see they're already installing kiosks and replacing cashiers and things like that. There's still some jobs there, but they're starting to replace those because you have automation that actually just does those things better. It just does. And that is the digital frontier. You're going to have a whole different way of working. You're going to have all kinds of different job functions that are now done by humans. And typically, you might even have the burger flippers, be a robot. That's not far-fetched. There are Boston Dynamics actually has a robot called Baxter that you can train to do things like that. That robot costs $25,000. It's a one-time capital investment. Compare that to an employee that you have to pay $30,000 a year plus benefits plus everything else. And you begin to see that's kind of a problem. Most businesses will just for survival, they'll opt for preferring. They'll take the hit on the capital investment because they'll recoup that on their investment in the first year over what they would have for an employee. Because when you start factoring in not only the cost of the employee and their benefits and their taxes and everything else, there's a burden rate that comes with having an employee there, some of which will go away when you have automation. So there's an economic shift happening there that's very profound. And that helps to define what I would be calling the digital frontier. Work is going to change. The kind of jobs that people do are going to change. And what's interesting, and the reason I'm wanting to kind of use AB5 as kind of a jumping off point is because I want to put it in that context. I want to put it in the context of this very dramatic shift from an industrial society to a digital society. And the gig economy is a really good picture of how that works. Okay? If you're an Uber driver, or if you deliver for Postmates or any of the many other things that people are doing in the gig economy, or you can add Airbnb to the gig economy as well. What you have is platforms which aggregate consumers and providers and taking away all the other layers of distribution and management from that equation. That reduces costs tremendously, and it also increases efficiency. Let's use Uber for the sake of discussion right now. I spent 10 years working for Sprint. I was an account executive, and what I did was work with different companies deploying technology. Well, one of the companies that I worked with was an airport shuttle company, pretty well known, and they had hundreds of vehicles and hundreds of drivers. And my job was providing them technology, their smartphones, the GPS tracking for their vehicles, and everything else. And so I spent several years very, very intimately involved in that process, in the process of customer contacting the company, booking a ride, dispatcher, assigning that ride to a driver, etc. Um, what I can say is it was a very labor intensive process. And if you compare that to Uber, what you have is you have a rider make a request, and because the devices are, you know, can connect to the internet and can connect via GPS, so that that request has a location associated with it, and the system goes out and finds the closest driver to that physical location. You compare that to what a dispatcher would have to do. Dispatcher would have to he'd look at his map and say, "I think this guy's here, but I got to call him. Where are you?" And he doesn't answer the phone. So he has to spend 5 minutes chasing him down. Meanwhile, the customer is waiting, going, "When can I get my ride?" You know. So you see that kind of a process, and what this platform has done is it's removed a huge amount of the friction and actually wasted time and energy from the process of just putting that rider and driver together. That digital frontier, I suspect, and I'm not alone in this, that approach is going to start spreading to other industries. It could spread to healthcare. It could spread to education. It could spread to a lot of other places where that kind of a platform that just puts the consumer that needs something and the provider that needs it together without all the other layers will take tremendous costs out of. We're facing staggering healthcare costs. Well, what if you just flattened all that out? And, in the healthcare field, you have a higher level of liability, you have all kinds of other things, but still, those things can be accounted for by the providers in an appropriate way. If you take all those extra layers out, all of a sudden the cost of healthcare goes down very dramatically, the same way that Uber's costs went down from what taxis would cost. Because taxis, you have to pay the city, you have to pay benefits, you have to pay all this stuff. Although some taxis, you buy um, you buy a taxi medallion, which like in the city of New York, that turned into a real racket. The taxi medallion in the city of New York is $1 million, and what the people who were doing, there were loan agents. I'll just put loan agents in quotes, who would loan people like foreigners coming to this country. They would loan them the money to do that, thinking, "Oh, well, you can be a taxi driver, and you pay this loan off. It's $1 million loan." Right? Which they never get out from under, and so they never really make money. They're just basically paying off their loan. That's what the taxi system in New York. That's the dark side of that. You don't hear a lot about that, but that's really part of what goes on. So what you have is this remarkable transition of how people work. Now, I want to go back to this issue of people on the digital frontier are afraid that they're not going to have a job. They're not going to have, there's not going to be jobs for people to do. Okay. Here's how I want to respond to that. In 1830, when you had to transition out of the farm to the factory, a lot of people stopped farming. Farming jobs kind of went away, at least working on the farm and growing food. However, fast forward to today, the United States has 2.4 million farmers. There's 2.4 million people involved in farming. That's less than 1% of the population is actually involved in farming. However, those farmers and the machines that they work with produce, and the very smart machines that they work for. I was at CES earlier this year, and I saw some of the stuff that John Deere has, where they have these huge machines that can drive down the field, and they can analyze whether this plant's getting enough water, whether the seed's germinating. The analytics you can get from these machines is staggering. And one guy can basically operate it, but for a workforce like that, very small workforce, which is really kind of a combination of artificial intelligence, robotics, and humans, those kind of farmers produce enough raw food material, fruits, vegetables, all kinds of other, nuts, all the things that they produce, to employ 37 million people. According to the government studies, basically the food industry sector in the United States employs about 37 million people. Now that includes not only things like supermarkets, but people who work in, food production plants, people who work in restaurants, and all kinds of other, people who make commercials for food. All of those things came about because those same people didn't have to spend their time just growing the food, which they used to have to do. They used to have subsistence farming. Most of the people were employed in that. Today, we have plenty of food material for people to work with, and that creates all kinds of other jobs. And so the digital frontier is going to create all kinds of other jobs, which we don't even understand yet, which because we don't have the resources, for example, fully operational, it's hard to define what those jobs are, but they're going to get defined over the next 20 or 30 years. That's going to get very clear. And I think one of the things that interests me in it, because I'm a bit of an amateur sociologist, one of the things that interests me about that is how people are going to work and what kind of jobs people are going to do. And I think today the kind of industrial paradigm where you go into your little cubicle and you do the same thing every day and produce the same thing every day, and you just keep doing that day in and day out and day in and day, and same thing every day and every day. That's the kind of job that's typically better done by a machine because they're more efficient, they don't get tired, they don't get sick, they don't make as many mistakes. So they're actually more efficient on some types of things, on those kind of repetitive tasks. But the fear people have is that, oh, there won't be any work for us. Here's where the gig economy comes in. The gig economy is this very flexible membrane, if you will, that allows people to work when they want to and not work when they don't. And it allows employers to be able to bring people in when they need them and let them go when they're not needed without any kind of, legal implications or repercussions that make it onerous or more expensive to do the business. I'm not against unions. I think there are certain types of occupations where unions are valuable because they create a better quality of work, because the union, or kind of on the old European guild model, creates level or creates standards that people have to meet in order to be part of that. That's a good thing. You see that in the entertainment industry, the Directors Guild. Well, uh, Screenwriters Guilds. All of those kinds of guilds. They're unions, but they also create a level of, or standards of work, that an employer might not be able to enforce on their own. So I think there's value in that in some cases. But back to this situation, let's bring it back to Uber and back to AB5. The study that was done at Harvard University about 2 years ago that said Uber drivers make $3 an hour. What they didn't tell you is that, I mean, that was what was reported in the news. Uber drivers are getting cheated. They're being taken advantage of, et cetera, et cetera. What they didn't tell you is 70% of drivers only work for 90 days or less. That means what you have is this very high turnover, very fluid workforce, and you have a relatively small group who's doing that more for a longer term. But even those people, because of the nature of how new jobs are evolving, because our economy is evolving, because our technologies are evolving, the flexibility is actually very important, not only for the individuals, but for the economy as a whole. See, that's what I think is really missing in AB5. I'm gonna kind of come back to that for a minute. Basically, what AB5 was, it was a case with a company called Dynamex versus the County of Los Angeles, and the company converted a workforce of employees to independent contractors. But they still worked more or less as employees under the company direction, doing what the company was telling them to do, pretty much. So the employees eventually sued, and was in the courts for like 10 years before it was finally settled. And one of the results of that case was a standard that was proposed. And it goes like this: it's a 3-point checklist. It's similar to the current federal guideline for what an independent contractor is, but it's different in one key area. One, the worker is free to perform services without the control or direction of the company. Two, the worker is performing work tasks that are outside the usual course of the company's business activities. And three, the worker is customarily engaged in an independently established trade, occupation, or business of the same nature as that involved in the work performed. In other words, it's very similar to what the federal standard is you do this kind of work for other people. Now, what's happened? This was really targeted toward the gig economy. It's pretty clear based on the way it was presented, based on the way it went through the assembly and everything else, that the state of California would, I'm sure, like to get employee taxes from all of the people who are working in the gig economy. I can appreciate that. And I think I have to say honestly, that's a very real concern. And I think the issue is rather more complex than people want to address it as. It's typically addressed as, well, workers are getting cheated. No, if you talk to the majority of people who are involved in the gig economy, with Uber or with Lyft or with Postmates or any of those, most of them, they don't want to be employees. They're doing something that pays them enough money so they can explore other things and build other skills which they'll need to do. See, that's what's necessary in order to transition, in order to be on the digital frontier and to move forward and arrive somewhere that makes sense. Many workers are going to have to acquire new skills that we don't even know what they are yet. So they have to be available to do that. So I think that's one of the reasons why this approach is out of step with the flow of history. The flow of history is taking us into a very different way of working. I think 30 years from now, you're going to have people who don't necessarily have to go to a location to work. They can plug in on their smartphone or plug in on their laptop or plug in from their desktop to do the work they want to do on demand when they want to whenever they want to. And somehow or other, that works. It works for the customer in Uber. It works quite well. People get where they need to go. So you have a very clearly defined task and a very orderly and frictionless process. Again, going back to that example of, I remember what it takes to have a dispatcher each time, talk to the customer, do this, do that. You have 20 steps in order to get that passenger in the car, whereas with Uber, you have 2: accept the request, arrive at the location, drive. It's not hard to see that trend is going to increase. And it's going to increase for a lot of reasons, because the technology is going to increase, because tasks that people do that machines can do better are going to take over. Machines will take over certain things, but it will make room for other things. But in that transition period, the gig economy is perfect, because it allows people who want to work the opportunity to do so. They're not going to get rich, but most of them are looking to transition to something else. So, any thoughts, my friend?
Yeah, I'll just take it in a spiritual direction for 5 minutes. So I think the underlying spiritual dimension of what you're talking about is fear, and we're talking about fear as disproportionate to reality. So, for example, if my computer ever doesn't work the way I expect, I immediately become seized by this enormous fear, or
Yep.
Dealing with technology. The printer doesn't work. I am seized by fear that the world is coming to an end. Or if I can't find my phone, oh no! Or anything technological, like the slightest thing that doesn't go as I expected, there's just this cold wave of fear that goes up and down my spine, and my body tightens up, and I feel like the whole world is collapsing in on me. And so the help that I found for that problem, and I have a father who wrote books on how not to worry, and my father was just filled with worry. He just passed away a year ago, but he was like the most worry-filled, unhappy person I ever knew, and yet he was writing books on happiness and how not to worry. But I mean, I grew up genetically and environmentally just programmed to worry, so very prone to fear. And I think that's a spiritual dimension to what you're talking about is change. Also, I find change fills me with fear. I'm someone who really likes a regular schedule. I get up at this time, I take a cold shower at this time, I take my protein drink at this time, I take my supplements at this time, I do this particular procedure at this time, and then I drive at this time, and I get to my destination around this time, and then I know I've got between an hour and a half and 2 hours to run through my other procedures and my prayers and my phone calls and everything to get started. So anything that interrupts my schedule tends to fill me with fear. So a change in my in my income stream would definitely fill me with fear. And what we're talking about here are changes to people's income streams, or potential changes or threats to their familiar ways of doing things, which for me tends to be very frightening. And so I had a sponsor who said, okay, Luke, I want you to write about this fear. Say, take a fear about learning new technology. So that's one of my fears. So learning any new technology, I tend to be quite afraid of. So write about how that fear serves you. So, okay, it serves me by directing me away from learning new technology to sticking to the things that I do well. So that's how it serves me. So I don't waste, you can waste hours just setting up your printer. So I don't do that. I have people that I call and I will pay if there's a sufficient technological problem. So this fear keeps me, in many ways, it serves me by keeping me on track, and doesn't, so I don't get distracted and going down paths that perhaps waste my time or something that I'm not good at, where if I just concentrate on things that I'm good at, I'll earn the money to pay other people to do the things that I'm not good at. So there are ways that my fears serve me. And then she had me write about, how does that fear hurt you? So it hurts me by keeping me small. I don't learn new skills. I don't learn new technology as readily and as easily as I could. I've got kind of blinders up. It's like I tend to look at life, okay, this I'm good at, and everything else I don't want to do, which keeps my life small, constrained, and is not exactly conducive to prosperity. Then so I wrote about all the ways that this fear would hold me back. Then I wrote about what would happen if I replaced my fear with faith, with generosity, with love, and with God seeking. And so that was really helpful, because then learning new technology would become more of an interesting challenge. It would be a way to grow. It would be a way to become more useful to myself, to other people, to be more of a blessing to the world, to be more of a blessing to my clients. And so when I started looking at things that way, if I learn new technology, I'll put on a better YouTube show. So when I then became intoxicated by all the ways it would serve me to replace my fear with faith. It's like, whoa, that's awesome. And so when I did that work, then I went out and learned Streamlabs OBS that we're streaming on right now. I learned the basics of it in about an hour or so. And I'd been dreading learning this software for about 2 years. I knew that eventually I'd have to do it, but I kept putting it off. Now with this new mindset, I was able to get to work, learn the new technology. Now I'm still learning constantly, but I found by practicing these spiritual principles in all of my affairs, I have much less fear. Now I feel like my fears, generally speaking, are far more proportionate to reality. Now, on occasion, they will flare up completely disproportionate to reality, but now I have a mechanism to deal with them. I can sit down, write them out, see how this particular fear is serving me, see how the fear is hurting me, and seeing how my life would benefit by replacing my fear with faith and generosity and love and God-seeking. And that's revolutionized my life. So I'll pass it back to you, Richard.
Yeah, that's such a good addition, or that's actually the appropriate expansion for this, because what I'm talking about this shift for how we work and the contexts and the environments and the ecosystems in which we're going to work, like a work ecosystem. Because I mean, these platforms are really work ecosystems, and how those work. One of the things that's going to really have to take place, you talk about fear and you talk about the spiritual dimension of that, one of probably the main or the most obvious benefit of spiritual practice is that your relationships with other people improve dramatically, because you have a different context for that. All of those, things like fear, and which all comes out of our basic instincts. Our basic instincts are wired. Some people will say, "Oh, well, the instincts we needed as hunter-gatherers, or the instincts we needed as, farmers in ancient Babylon or whatever. We don't need those anymore." I actually disagree with that, because the problems may be different. 2,000 years ago, life was very cheap. We didn't have um, government systems that actually gave people rights. We have rights today that 2,000 years ago people didn't have, or 1,000 years ago people didn't have. It started shifting around the time of the Magna Carta, where you started realizing, okay, you've got three main constituencies. You've got the people, population. You've got the people who control the means of production, and you've got the government. Now, in England, with the Magna Carta, that was basically the peasants, the landowners, and the king. But those three basic constituents are still hold true, and they're really not going to change. You're always going to have some form of hierarchy. You're always going to have pressure from the bottom to change things and make things better. You're always going to have pressure from the top to go, well, we have to get this done so things will work. And you're always going to have people who will take advantage of that system one way or the other. So you need a referee, which usually is government, unless government becomes the one who controls the means of production, in which case that doesn't usually turn out well, because then there's nothing to keep that force in check. It becomes dominant in a way that ultimately destroys the society as a whole. So, but the point I'm really getting at is that the things that cause us to be afraid trigger the same systems, regardless of what it is, or whether it's a Roman soldier coming down the street, ready to say, I'm going to kill you because I don't like the way you look, or a guy who cuts in front of you in traffic. Our nervous system is wired to respond to threats using the same mechanism, irregardless. And 12 step in my experience, and I think in the experience we share, is that I have found it to be a simple, practical way to, first of all, retrain those instincts to respond appropriately, recognizing what they are, recognizing that those fears are there because I perceive them as a threat, but learning how to evaluate it appropriately. That takes practice. That takes practice that most of the time people don't have the opportunity to practice that. They just get people get kids, they get thrown into being a parent, they have no idea what that means. They go to school, they learn a trade, and they go out to do a job, and they have no idea what that is. And so they don't know how to conduct healthy relationships. I mean, I'm not saying it's not a blanket statement, but if you look at the amount of anxiety, depression, addiction, and all those things that are that are growing today, they're not problems that are diminishing, they're problems that are growing. That's evidence that we don't know how to manage relationships. And I think on the digital frontier, our capacity for healthy, fulfilling, productive relationships is going to become paramount. It'll become more important than having a PhD. And in fact, if you look at some of the statistics that they talk about emotional intelligence, and most people are familiar with Daniel Goleman's book about that, but it's those relational skills, and it's actually the same guy who coined that phrase. Daniel Goleman wrote a book called Social Intelligence, which talks about the way we operate in groups. And I think that the way the digital frontier is going to open up an entirely new way of people working together that will require them to have vastly better interpersonal skills than most people do now. Many people can go to their job and hide in a cubicle and maybe talk to somebody at the water cooler and maybe talk to their boss when their boss comes to talk to them, but they're usually terrified of their boss because they think they're going to get fired, they think they're going to make a mistake. They're living in fear because if something goes wrong, their survival is threatened, and that kicks in all those basic instincts, which until we understand them and until we make our peace with them and recognize that they're there for our benefit, like you said, because they are there for our benefit. But if we don't really have practice, and that's the word, practice, we have to practice that. Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers talks about the 10,000 hour rules, that any skill, whether it's computer programming, playing a musical instrument, whatever, it takes about 10,000 hours to master a skill, a complex skill. I would argue that relationships are a complex skill. And I think that if you were to inquire into the average person, I think you would find that most people don't really spend a lot of time acquiring relationship skills. And I
Yeah.
think one of the really keys to success in the workplace of the future is going to be those kind of skills. Now, this is very interesting. Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State under Richard Nixon, I believe, said that 12-step was America's greatest contribution to the 20th century. And I would love to reach out to him and ask him, why did you say that, Dr. Kissinger? Because there's really not a lot of explanation for what the context of why he said that, but that is attributed to him. And I would agree with that, because that is a structure to learn profoundly reliable interpersonal skills. And those interpersonal skills, really operate on two levels. They operate on, the level of knowing yourself, who you are, how you function, what works for you and what doesn't. That's why, when they talk about a fearless and thorough moral inventory, and certainly at the time that was written, most people never attempted that. I think that's still true. I think most people never really attempt a fearless and thorough moral inventory of their lives, unless they're backed into a corner and their lives fall apart. But I think waiting for that to happen is perhaps not so wise. I think we're coming into a time where it's something we're going to have to do. I think we need to get a PhD in being a human being. I'm being a little bit facetious in saying that. I'm not thinking we should do that in school, because I don't think schools will teach that very well. But I think it's something that as human beings we have to be dedicated to. We have to be dedicated to what it takes to have healthy relationships, because the demands placed on human interaction in settings where creativity and innovation and those kinds of skills are going to be in demand. Those skills require, really, for you to be secure as a human being, for you to be secure with yourself, and for you to be secure with other people. And if you're not, the efforts will suffer. And so people who don't have those skills will be, or people who do have those skills will be preferred over people who don't. So I think that's a huge, huge issue. One I'm, very, very engaged in and very fascinated by, and it really occupies a lot of my imagination at this time.
Let me read to you a sentence and get your feedback on it. It's from Ralph Waldo Emerson. If you love and serve men, you cannot by any hiding or stratagem escape the remuneration. If you love and serve men, you cannot by any hiding or stratagem escape the remuneration. What do you think?
I have to kind of digest that. It's a very interesting remuneration.
Yeah.
Or remuneration. What is there a context for that? Because I think
I'm sure there is.
I think it means more than financial.
Yeah. Well, let me just give my thoughts on it. So I pulled it out of the William James book. I just read his book, The Varieties of the Religious Experience.
Oh, isn't that a great book?
Yeah.
I'm 3/4 of the way through that now.
Yeah, but let me just share my thoughts on this. If you love and serve man, cannot by any hiding or stratagem escape the remuneration. So I have found I used to be primarily interested in what is true, and that drove me into my 20s. And now in my 50s, I'm equally interested in what works. Like what are glasses that you can put on that help you to live a more happy, prosperous life? Like, what are approaches to other people, to myself, to the universe, to work that enable me to have a better life? And this idea that if you serve other people, if you love and serve other people, that you will receive reward is just a useful approach. Not in the sense that you do something nice for somebody and there's no reward and so you get ticked off, but it's just a useful mindset for approaching life, is to live a life of love and service. It just works. There are just all sorts of approaches to life that just work, whether or not they're true. It just seems to be something that works. If you have a mindset of being of service to your employer, or if you have a mindset of being of service to your client, and you make that your number one consideration, then in that work experience, then everything goes much better. For example, I got fired from a lot of jobs for inappropriate speech in the workplace. I was using jobs to pick up women. I was using jobs to try to form like inappropriately intense relationships. I was doing everything at work but working. And this happened a lot because I never really had any interest in being of service to anyone. What I primarily was interested in was either hooking up or getting admiration from people. So I would say things, I would strike the pose or I would, sometimes I'd even work hard if I could see that I'd get praise for it, that I would get admiration for it. So I remember I had 3 miserable days working construction in the summer of 1986, and just absolutely miserable. And the 4th day, we went to this new house, a mansion, and the owner of the house, who turned out to be a construction titan who would go on to survive a famous plane crash, he noticed me and he said, "Oh, you're from Australia." So it was like the first human interaction in my 4 days on construction work. And it just like immediately filled me up. It wasn't admiration, but it was just like someone noticing that I'm a human being. It just felt so amazing. And I just like doggedly served that man for the next 3 years, like every chance I could, because everything that I do, he'd appreciate it. And it just filled me up. So I would go to work to either to meet women or to just like get filled up or to meet all sorts of my, twisted or pathetic or primitive psychological needs. This was not an approach to work that resulted in prosperity. Instead, I found 12-step, and I was encouraged to, when I go to work, to be of service to my employer or to be of service to my clients. And then magically, all the things that got me into trouble in the workplace, they just disappeared. And I didn't even have to fight them. I didn't have to fight not speaking inappropriately to other people. I didn't have to fight doing things that are inappropriate in the workplace. I didn't have to fight all the other things that had consistently gotten me fired or demoted or humiliated in the workplace. They went all away when I simply put God first, other people first. I'm here to be of service to my employer, or here to be of service to this particular client. Then all those other problems went away. So just simply putting on that new pair of glasses, taking that new approach to employment, taking that new approach to other people, then all of my psychological baggage, all my personality disorders, all my psychopathologies, all my psychopathic tendencies, all my familiar ways of using people and abusing people, they just disappeared. It just all the ways that I had previously felt compelled to participate in my own destruction just disappeared just by taking on that new attitude. So there are certain attitudes that just really serve you in life. So, for example, the attitude, I ruled the world, not an attitude that serves you in life. The attitude that, I hate Jews or I hate blacks or I hate Mexicans. It's not an attitude that serves you in life. If there's another way that you can like reframe things, you'll be more effective in life. And so the attitude that if I am of service to other people, if I love and serve my fellow man, that's should be near the top of my priorities in my work time. That's just an attitude that works. Back to you, Richard.
I could not agree with you more. Um, when someone asks me, well, what's your vision or what's your purpose in life? It's very simple for me. It's to love God and serve the people that serve God and serve the people that God puts in my life. Love them. It's real simple. And what's interesting about that is that that rules out a lot of things. Like you said, it really rules out selfishness, self-centeredness, and all of those things because you're either doing one or the other. You're either heading in one direction or you're heading in the other direction. You're either heading into, you know, selfish tendencies, distorted instincts, addictions, you know, um, and other socially destructive behaviors, or you're heading in the direction of doing things that build healthy relationships. Human beings are built for cooperation. We are designed to cooperate. Our our neurotransmitters actually support that. One of the most important neurotransmitters, oxytocin, is one. It promotes health. It promotes um, better mental acuity. It promotes all kinds of really positive things, and really, that usually is secreted into your body when you do altruistic actions, or when you're kind to people, when you serve people, when you do things that you know will do other people good. It releases that. It literally, there's a physiological, neurological support for the way the human being is designed that supports our well-being purely from a physiological standpoint. But you can take that beyond that into a spiritual dimension very easily, although I don't think there's necessarily in human beings a complete. I think we're whole. I think we're whole, that our mind and our body and our spirits are all connected, not in a linear way, but they really do operate together. And when one of those things is off in the wrong direction, especially when it's not spirit, when you're not operating in a spiritual direction, which is toward those things that you know put us in positive relationships. Now, with God, I think one aspect of God is that God is reality. That is so. One of the things that let's say addicts typically struggle with, and most people on one level or another struggle with this, but it's a little bit more noticeable in an addict, is they don't want to accept reality. They do not want to accept life on life's terms. That's reality. So if you don't have that right, everything else is going to be off. Everything else is going to be out of kilter, because all of your thinking is going to be based on a fiction of what you think is going on instead of the reality of what's going on. And that's one of the key things in 12 step is it says, you don't try to, it talks about it in the third step about um, you're like an actor trying to run the whole show. You want to get this person to do this, you want to get this person to do that, so you can be happy, so it can be good, so you can have everything you need, so you can be happy. And the opposite of that is to see things the way they are and fit yourself to them. And what that often looks like in real life situations is, well, I'm a husband. Well, I serve my wife. I love my wife, and I serve her. I do what she needs, even sometimes when I don't particularly want to, but because I know it's really helpful for her, or I know it's beneficial for her, I'm going to do that. And a little bit like going to the dentist, it might not be fun to go to the dentist, but after you get done and after your teeth feel great and after you're healthy that way, it's like, wow, it was totally worth it. And that's when we get that release of things like that's when we get that oxytocin release in our body.
And I want to be clear that living a life of love and service to other people doesn't mean that you become a doormat. For example, I take a lot of outreach calls at my various programs, but unless it's a friend, I'm not going to listen to someone's problems for more than 2 minutes. Then we need to start talking about the solution, the big book, the steps, the tools. So it doesn't. If I allowed it, people would call up and talk about their broken computer or the difficulty of buying a car or their medical conditions for hours. Also, there are some people who are just so stuck in depression that after I've spent 6, 8 lengthy phone conversations with them, I just give up. I don't return their calls anymore because I just don't feel
Right.
like I can be of any service to them. Also, it's no service if say I'm on a job and I'm taking time away from my job to take people's outreach calls, and I'm just stealing from a client or an employer. It also means that I take care of myself, so I don't exhaust myself. I get cranky if I don't take care of myself. So this doesn't mean a life of love and service doesn't mean that you let other people use and abuse you. So, for example, if someone's sponsee is rude, I mean, we're coming to the end of that relationship. Or one potential sponsee, I said, do these 3 assignments, and he came back. He'd only done part of all 3, and but was absolutely convinced that he'd done all of them. And so I just said, okay, you didn't do this assignment. You only did the first page. There are 4 pages to this assignment, so please never again tell me that you've done an assignment when you haven't. And like, he reacted very badly, and we've never spoken again. So
Hmm. Yeah.
one of the benefits for me in 12-step work is that I immediately just call people out. Like, if someone's stepping on my toes, I say, hey, you're stepping on my toes, please step back. If someone's mistreating me, I say, hey, that's over boundary, that's inappropriate, I'm not going to put up with that. Or depending on the circumstance, but I just become very quick of recognizing when people are taking advantage. And before, I was so filled with shame and self-loathing that much of the time that I'd just allow people to mistreat me because I felt that I deserved it. But when you
Mm.
develop a sense of you're a child of God and other people are children of God, when people start to take advantage of you, which they inevitably will, particularly if you show any kindness out in the world, there will be some people who start to try to take advantage of you. But also through practicing a proper spiritual path with appropriate mentors, you will very quickly just clue in when someone's taking advantage, and boom, you can just deal with it right there without getting angry or resentful. You can just get right to the point and be appropriately assertive rather than aggressive.
Yeah. And that's really the key. Um, to put it in a familiar spiritual context, love your neighbor as yourself.
Mm,
And I think what you just described is what that looks like.
yeah.
Because y- you and your neighbor are both of great value. And in 12 step it says we're to be self-supporting through our own contributions, which means, we have to be responsible for taking care of ourselves and doing that in a way that contributes to the people around us. That's that's really what it is. And so there is that. Really, so much of life is, there's a spectrum, and there's usually an optimal range within that spectrum that you try to stay in for a healthy, happy, productive life. And I think you'd kind of describe that in that, okay, if you're going to be angry and threatened when somebody, tries to take advantage of you, you're going to blow up their relationship. That's on the dark half of the spectrum, you know. Whereas if you say to them, well, gosh, hey, I really can't do that. I just, that's not something I can do. Um, without being mean. In fact, I love the way it said is to say what you mean what you say, don't say it mean. I think that's a really great slogan that really frames that it's important for me to take care of myself. It's important for each of us to do that. And this idea of boundaries, other people are not responsible for my boundaries. I am. I'm responsible for my boundaries. If so, and it's almost to expect other people to just read my mind and know what those boundaries are. um, it's unreasonable. That won't happen. And yeah, you're right, there are people out there who will take and take and take until you say no. And the minute you say, and I had experience in business with people like that who just kept taking and taking and taking. But the minute you say no, they just get okay, they move on to something else. It's like they'll just take until you get, until you, and as long as you give, they'll take. Because perhaps in their mind, they're assuming that that's okay. And if I don't inform them it's not okay, well, that's on me, not on them.
Yeah. I'm one thing that I notice about people usually early in recovery, they're frequently proclaiming their boundaries. When I entered therapy on a regular basis in 1998, one of the first things that my therapist gave me was a sheet on boundaries, and I very much needed it because my boundaries were weak and my respect for other people's boundaries was quite weak. So I'd never really thought about boundaries before as a lesson I absolutely needed. But I do notice from now my approximate decade in 12-step programs is that when people get into recovery, they start proclaiming their boundaries. And then I also notice that the healthiest people I know almost never have to state their boundaries because they're just obvious. Like the healthier you get, the less
Hmm.
you need to state your boundaries because it just becomes so obvious that people get the messages that you're sending out into the world, and so you don't have to say them out loud.
And part, I think a part of maintaining those boundaries too is just knowing what situations are going to be troublesome for you and staying out of them in the first place, not even putting yourself in that position. you know um it's kind of a comical anecdote, but I was a contractor for a while, and we got called into a lot of wealthy homes to work for people, and you see all kinds of people. Um, some people with money really are dear souls and honorable, full of integrity, delightful. They care about other people. They do good things, and I certainly experienced a number of those kind of people. But I also experienced that other kind of person we were talking about who just take whatever you give them, and they don't care. They don't care the consequences to you at all. Um, we were called to a mansion in Bel Air. Um, just to be discreet, I'm not going to mention the person's name, but it's a well-known wife of a very well-known television producer. If I said the name, you'd know what I mean. And she had a koi pond in the front yard, and some California live oak trees and some other things. And we were invited by her assistant to uh, bid on bid on this, to look at. She said she had a problem. We get there. She kind of comes out the front door, and she's wearing this very um, flamboyant outfit, and is aware of that, and is being very flamboyant, just kind of bigger than life. And she says, "I can't see my fish. I need a new filtration system. I can't see my fish. And I need to make this pond bigger. It needs this and it needs that." Now, on one level, this is, you look at the estate. This person has gazillion dollars. Money is not an object for this person, not at all. They'll spend their money on whatever they want to spend it on, and they have plenty to do. But the first thing I do is I look at the pond. It had just been cleaned, and there's no way in any universe that it could have been better, cleaner, or better maintained than it was. It was perfect. Nothing needed to be done. She was not happy. and then she was pointing in a direction. Well, let's take that tree out and make the pond bigger. The truth about that is that it was a California live oak, and you really can't take those out. You really can't do anything to them. The state looks dimly on any attempts to cut them down or modify them or anything like that. You just don't do it. You can be fined huge amounts of money. Now, she probably didn't care about that, but as a contractor, I certainly cared about that. And so, we listened, and we were very polite, and we nodded and said, "Well, thank you. We'll get back to you." That's all we did. And I did a little bit of homework, and my wife, who was in PR at the time, was very familiar with this person, and said, "Oh, she's been through 5 assistants this year." And I said to myself, well, I think in terms of whether her pond is clean or not, I think she either needs a better pair of glasses or maybe she needs a 12-step program, but she doesn't need a new filtration system. So we very politely just bowed out of that. And I know that there are people who would go that, "Oh, we're gonna do this and we're gonna do that." That's just not having good boundaries. I was very clear on what my boundaries were. It's like, I'm not going to take on work for someone who's never going to be happy. I'm not going to do things that are illegal or questionable. I'm not going to do something for somebody that they really don't need just because they're willing to pay me money for it. That's just not my playbook. So I just, without getting into it with her, without saying anything, was very kind to her assistant. We said, "We'll get back to you." And of course, we got back and said, "Yeah, we're really not interested in this. Thanks so much for the opportunity." And to me, that's really enforcing boundaries in a way that, well, we certainly, if we wanted to talk to them again, they wouldn't object to having us over there. We were very polite. We were very, appropriate in everything we did and said. So and that's, I mean, it's a specific example, but I think it highlights that I have to be responsible for what I do. If I decided, oh, I got to do this, I'm going to work for this person and be pissed off when they don't pay me, because the truth is she was never going to be happy, and no matter what I did, I probably would struggle to get paid anyway. Because if you ought to do more of this, and there'd be no way to do it, and so I'd never get paid, and she'd have a perfect justification for doing that, at least in her own mind. So that's certainly a practical business example of boundaries, but it shows up in personal life too. When my wife gets angry, I tend to say, "Look, whatever it is we're talking about here, it's too important. I'm not going to argue with you. We'll talk about this later, but I'm not going to argue with you now, because obviously this is important to you, and I want to give it the respect that it's due. But I don't want to spend time getting angry and arguing. I just don't want to do that." And most of the time, I don't even have to say it quite like that. I just have to say, "Well, let's talk about this later," and that's it. She kind of knows what that means. So, you come to the point where you know what's appropriate in a relationship, and of course, there comes a point where some people can't, play nice. You just withdraw from that. That's enforcing your boundaries.
Yeah. I remember talking to a friend about an abusive boss I had, and how much money that I would need from him to keep working for him. And my friend said, if someone said to me what this guy says to you on a daily basis, I would walk out of there right there, because my friend is far healthier than I am. Like, I will put up for years and years and years being in an abusive relationship. My friend, who's a healthier person, a more high functioning person than myself, many of my friends, if they'd gotten like that kind of abuse in one day, they would walk out right away. So I love it when I meet healthy people, and I am inspired by how quickly they spot an unhealthy situation and just ditch it. So I'm constantly inspired by people around me. Let me read a little bit from chapter 5 of the big book, How It Works. Rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. Those who do not recover are people who cannot or will not completely give themselves to the simple program, usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. So there are quite a few people who appear constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. There are quite a few people, I think, in almost everybody's life who are unable to see any role for their own choices in their own unhappiness. So what do we do if, hey, we got a family member or coworkers or employers or clients or people who it's not easy to be rid of? Obviously, if you have a choice, you just get rid of such people, generally speaking. But if they're not easy to dislodge, how do we deal with people who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves? Any thoughts?
Um, one of the things that guides me in that situation, again, it brings me back to my own boundaries, is if I have a problem with somebody else's behavior, it's my problem. So I have to. One of the places where I learned this lessons was with my mom. My mom was a very difficult person through most of my life, and in the last few years of her life, I took care of her. I set up my business to run out of her house so I could, physically be there to care for her and still, take care of what I needed to take care of. I'd spend the weekends with my wife, but I'd spend, during the week caring for my mom because she really needed that. Um, but she was a very difficult person. Um, she was an active alcoholic, although she would never have admitted that.
Obviously.
She would never have thought that. She would not think of her. We had a next door neighbor who was she was a sloppy drunk and a mean drunk. And, she wouldn't think of herself as that. That was her picture of an alcoholic. But, someone who is, you know, doesn't always recognize their part in a situation. But one thing I learned to do, I learned to first disconnect from whatever upset I had about how she behaved, which is, if I have a problem with somebody else's behavior, it's my problem. So how do I deal with whatever upset I have? Because if I what you learn very quickly with someone like that is if you try to get them to change their behavior, the behavior gets worse. That's You can almost count on that. And what it will do is escalate the situation very dramatically and and very destructively. It doesn't work. I used to do that uh, with with my wife and my mother, with other people, and I'd end up with an emotional hangover for 2 days. It put me in such a funk because if someone doesn't want to solve a problem, and you're trying to get them to solve it, you're it's. There was an old writer called Uncle Remus, and there was a scene with Brer Fox and Brer Rabbit, and you know Brer Fox built a tar baby to catch the rabbit, and of course the rabbit would come along and start talking to the tar baby, and the tar baby wouldn't say anything, and then he'd hit the tar baby, and hand would get stuck in there, and then he'd start yelling at the tar baby, and then tar baby he don't say nothing. He hit it again, and pretty soon he's stuck in the thing. I think that's a little anecdote for what it is trying to fix someone that doesn't want to be fixed. You're just gonna keep putting energy to it, and you're gonna get more and more stuck, and you're gonna get more and more frustrated. That's what's gonna happen. So what I learned, though, is I learned to really observe what the way what I learned is my mom was trying to express her needs in very inappropriate and very distorted ways. But I started to really take the time to notice what she might need, and in a very quiet, um, like doing it so not even to be found out, taking care of what she needed so that she didn't need to behave that way anymore because she was getting what she needed. And it really didn't bother me because, well, uh, I'm there to love God and serve Him and love the people that God puts in my life. So I got to really exercise that with a really difficult person. And what ended up happening is that, you know, our relationship just kept getting better because she was getting her needs met. She was respecting my boundaries. I was respecting hers without her really participating because I was able to bring a level of perception and compassion to that
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
worked. Now, that what I described, that was a very personal experience. Now, some people have, people that maybe won't respond to that are just malevolent, that are just malicious, period. And in cases like that, all you can do is really step back from someone like that. You have to find a way to withdraw. But if you can't, and I think that was a question you asked. Well, what do you do with that? Um, and I think, again, to me, the principle I come back to is, if I have a problem with somebody else's behavior, if I take responsibility for my responses, if I take responsibility for myself and my feelings, I can learn how to deal with them. I mean, I like it, but I can learn to do it in a way that can maintain boundaries that are appropriate for me. It's a challenge, and I think it takes spiritual help. I find that I need God's help for that, um, personally, because that was certainly what I relied on in the situation with my mom. Because for 50 plus years, I really didn't get along with her,
Yeah.
and I really disliked her and just barely tolerated her. But I come to find out that now I miss her because I really grew to have. I always had affection for her, but that got um, tarnished with all the stuff that was unpleasant. When I took responsibility for my feelings, when I took responsibility for the effect that those things had on me, and without trying to change her, just dealt with the effect it was having on me, that's a spiritual thing. That's a spiritual practice of taking what 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 is difficult for me to deal with into my prayer closet, and letting God give me a different perspective, which usually is one of compassion, understanding, and wisdom, which usually operates better than being angry, trying to manipulate, and trying to force solutions.
And probably the best 12-step program for learning to get along with other people is Al-Anon, which originally developed for the wives of alcoholics in AA. But you don't have to have an alcoholic in your life to benefit from a program like Al-Anon, because it's really about learning to deal with and get along with sick people, and everybody's sick to some extent. Do you want to say anything about Al-Anon?
Well, as a matter of fact, I'm currently working the Al-Anon steps with my Al-Anon sponsor, who's been my sponsor for a number of years, and I just wanted to do that because I wanted to dig a layer deeper. It's kind of a master class for me because my sponsor is an Al-Anon ninja. I mean, he is just a master. He's got 30 years, and he really is. He is my picture of what love looks like in a human practice. He is. I don't want to put him on a pedestal because he has his issues. Trust me, but he knows how to love people, and he does, and he knows how to keep appropriate boundaries, and he knows how to deal with difficult people and disarm them, very gently and very appropriately. and I want to learn more of that. And what's interesting too is he gets a lot done. Um, it's interesting when we have, you know, relationships that are full of contention and friction and anger and manipulation and all those things, we don't get very much done because we're applying our energy to dealing with all those emotional issues. That takes energy to do that. It takes energy to be angry. It takes energy to, you know, try to remember what you lied about. It takes energy to do all those things. Whereas, really accepting people for who they are, and that just going back to that, how do you deal with a difficult person is accepting them for who they are and seeing that there are probably good things in them too, and really holding the space for those things to come out. That can be done in many cases, not every case, but more cases than most people are willing to test or try. You really can do that with people. And when you do that, it frees you to be able to accomplish more, to be more productive. It actually frees up your time.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I think we're coming near the end. Any final words that you'd like to share?
Well, I'm really glad you brought it to the spiritual dimension of it. I think it's very appropriate because just to kind of cap this discussion about where we are in the transformation of how we work, these dynamics that we're talking about are crucial. They're absolutely paramount for people to be able to deal with I think what's ahead of us. So that would be how I'd want to, you know, kind of anchor that statement and kind of anchor that conversation in that.
Okay, great. I'll close just by reading this one paragraph here from the Big Book. Chapter 5, How It Works, page 58. Rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path, and those who do not recover are people who cannot or will not completely give themselves to this simple program, usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. There are such unfortunates. They are not at fault. They seem to have been born that way. They're naturally incapable of grasping and developing a manner of living which demands rigorous honesty. Their chances are less than average. There are those who suffer from grave emotional and mental disorders, but many of them do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Great,
Bye.
great, great place to end it. Thank you, Lou.